The wind carried the first bite of autumn across the San Juan Mountains, as a lone rider emerged from the Golden Hills, his horse moving more from loyalty than strength. His trail coat was faded by years beneath the Colorado sun. His boots were white with dust, and the lines on his weathered face told the story of a man who had ridden farther than most would dare. Yet it was not exhaustion that lingered most deeply in Daniel Brooks's calm blue eyes. It was hunger. The kind of hunger that slowly steals hope before it steals strength. Before we continue this journey through the American frontier, we'd love to invite you to join our growing family of Western story lovers. If tales of courage, kindness, and second chances speak to your heart, take a moment to subscribe. Every new story keeps the spirit of the Old West alive, and we're grateful to have you riding beside us. The autumn sun drifted lower, as Daniel followed a narrow trail winding through the rolling Colorado hills. Cottonwood trees shimmered in brilliant shades of gold, while cold mountain air carried the promise that winter was no longer far away. His faithful bay gelding stumbled once. Daniel gently rubbed the horse's neck. "Easy, boy," he whispered. "We'll find something." Neither of them had eaten properly in nearly 2 days. A failed cattle drive had left Daniel without wages. The little money he'd carried had been spent helping another traveler repair a broken wagon several days earlier. Since then, he had survived on creek water and whatever berries he could gather along the trail. But now, even those had disappeared beneath the cooling weather. As the last rays of sunlight touched the valley, Daniel noticed smoke rising beyond a grove of cottonwoods. A ranch. Not a large one, just a modest homestead, surrounded by weathered split-rail fences, a faded red barn, and a small herd of cattle grazing quietly across the pasture. A hand-painted sign near the entrance read, "Whitfield Ranch." Daniel hesitated. He had never enjoyed asking anyone for help. Still, hunger had a way of humbling even the proudest cowboy. He removed his black felt hat before approaching the porch. The front door opened slowly. A woman stepped outside, wiping flour from her hands onto a cream-colored apron. Margaret Whitfield looked no older than 37. Her chestnut hair rested neatly in a braid over one shoulder, and although weariness showed beneath her gentle hazel eyes, kindness remained stronger than hardship. She studied the stranger carefully. Daniel lowered his head respectfully. "Mom," he said softly, "I hate to trouble you. I was wondering if you might spare a little food. I can work for it, if you've got chores needing done." Margaret glanced toward the fading sky before looking back at the tired horse. Then she noticed how carefully Daniel stood, despite his obvious exhaustion. "You've ridden a long way." "I have. When did you last eat?" Daniel offered a small smile. "It's been a while." Margaret looked toward the kitchen window. Daniel almost expected her to apologize. Most ranch families struggled before winter. Instead, she quietly stepped aside. "Come inside." The cabin smelled of fresh bread and simmering stew. It was warm. Warmer than anywhere Daniel had been in weeks. 9-year-old Lucy Whitfield peeked around the corner, her golden curls bouncing as she studied the stranger, with curious blue eyes. Near the fireplace sat Ezra Whitfield, Margaret's elderly father-in-law. His silver beard rested against his work shirt as he slowly carved a piece of wood while leaning upon his walking cane. Margaret opened the cast-iron pot resting over the stove. Daniel noticed something immediately. There wasn't much left, just enough for one meal. She filled a single bowl anyway. Chunks of beef, potatoes, onions, carrots, and herbs floated beneath the rising steam. She carried it toward him. "I'm afraid it isn't fancy." Daniel stared at the bowl. "Ma'am?" She smiled gently. A warm meal shouldn't come with an apology. Daniel accepted it carefully, almost afraid to touch it. The first spoonful brought warmth back into his body. He ate slowly, respectfully, never wasting a single drop. Lucy watched with quiet fascination. "Are you really a cowboy?" Daniel smiled. "I've spent most of my life riding." Ezra chuckled softly. "Looks like life rode you just as hard." Daniel laughed for the first time in many days. "I suppose it did." The simple meal lasted only a few minutes. Yet it felt like a feast. When he finished, he carefully wiped the bowl clean with the final piece of bread. He stood immediately. "I appreciate this more than you'll ever know." Margaret shook her head. "Everyone deserves a hot meal." Daniel reached into his coat pocket. Only a few worn coins remained. He placed them on the table. Margaret quietly pushed them back. "No. I can't take charity." "It isn't charity." She smiled again. "It's simply supper." Daniel looked around the small cabin, the worn furniture, the patched curtains, the nearly empty pantry shelves. He realized something that tightened his chest. She had given him almost everything they had, without asking who he was, without expecting anything in return. He slowly placed his black hat back upon his head. Then he looked Margaret directly in the eyes. "I'll never forget this kindness." Before sunrise the next morning, Daniel quietly saddled his horse. Not wishing to disturb the family, he left without another word. Only hoofprints remained in the frost. Days passed, then weeks. The mountains grew colder. Golden leaves disappeared beneath gray skies. Finally, the season's first heavy snow drifted across Whitfield Ranch. Margaret stood beside the window, watching white flakes settle over the fences. Winter had arrived. A sudden knock echoed across the cabin. Lucy looked toward the door. Ezra slowly rose from his chair. Margaret wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped onto the porch. A lone rider waited beyond the falling snow. He removed his hat. Daniel smiled gently and said, "I told you I wouldn't forget." For a long moment, none of us moved. Snowflakes drifted lazily between the porch roof and the yard, settling across Daniel Brooks's weathered trail coat and the broad shoulders of the two draft horses standing patiently behind him. Their harnesses jingled softly in the winter morning stillness, and only then did Margaret Whitfield notice what waited beyond the falling snow. A wagon. Then another. Both piled high beneath heavy canvas covers. Daniel lowered his black felt hat respectfully. "I hope I'm not too late." Margaret stared at him, unable to find words. You came back." "I gave my word." Lucy rushed to the doorway, her bright blue eyes growing wider with every passing second. "Grandpa Ezra!" she shouted. "It's the cowboy!" Ezra Whitfield stepped carefully onto the porch with the help of his walking cane. His silver beard caught tiny snowflakes as he studied the wagons behind Daniel. "What have you brought?" Daniel smiled modestly. "Only what your kindness bought." He walked to the first wagon and untied the thick canvas ropes. Margaret gasped. Sacks of flour, cornmeal, beans, coffee, sugar, salt, barrels of cured meat, blankets, firewood, lantern oil, winter clothing, even children's boots, carefully wrapped in brown paper. The second wagon held rolled fencing wire, lumber, nails, leather tack, horse feed, seed grain, and enough supplies to carry the Whitfield Ranch safely through the harsh Colorado winter. Lucy covered her mouth in amazement. Is all of this for us?" Daniel nodded. "Every bit of it." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "We can't possibly repay this." "You already have." She looked at him, confused. "I only gave you one bowl of stew." Daniel's gentle smile never changed. That bowl reminded me what kind of people still lived in this world. He quietly led the horses toward the barn while Ezra examined the supplies with growing disbelief. Inside the warm cabin, Margaret finally gathered enough courage to ask the question that had lived in her heart ever since Daniel disappeared. "How?" Daniel accepted a cup of hot coffee before answering. 3 days after I left here, I came across a ranch outside Durango." He looked thoughtfully into the fire. The owner's cattle had scattered during an early storm. Half the hands had quit. Ezra nodded slowly. "Bad weather will do that. They asked for help. So you stayed." Daniel smiled. "I've never been very good at riding away from folks in trouble." For nearly 2 weeks, he helped recover lost cattle, repaired broken corrals, and led the exhausted herd safely through the mountain passes before another blizzard arrived. When the work was finished, The elderly ranch owner called Daniel into his office. The man had no children, no close family, only failing health. He told me he'd spent years searching for someone he could trust. Daniel looked toward Margaret. He said he wasn't simply paying me. He was giving me responsibility. The grateful ranch owner transferred ownership of the successful cattle drive to Daniel, making him a full partner in the operation. It changed everything. Margaret smiled softly. So the first thing you did was come back. Daniel looked around the little cabin. I remembered this place every single day. Lucy quietly slipped her small hand into Daniel's. I knew you'd come back. Daniel chuckled. I hoped I would. The following morning, before the sun climbed above the snowy mountains, Daniel was already outside working. Without asking permission, without expecting thanks, he inspected every broken fence surrounding the cattle pasture. Several sections leaned dangerously beneath heavy snow. He removed his gloves. We'll fix these first. Margaret frowned. You don't have to do this. I know. He picked up a hammer. But winter certainly won't wait. Soon the quiet ranch echoed with the sounds of rebuilding. Boards were replaced. Loose gates reinforced. Barn doors straightened. The livestock shelter received a stronger roof before another snowstorm could arrive. Even Lucy insisted on carrying small buckets of nails, while Ezra carefully measured fresh fence rails from his chair nearby. For the first time since her husband's passing, Margaret heard laughter drifting across Whitfield Ranch again. Not forced laughter, real laughter. Hope had returned with the man who had once asked for nothing more than supper. But not everyone welcomed the change. Across the valley stood the sprawling Kane Ranch. Its owner, Victor Kane, watched the growing activity through the windows of his elegant ranch house. His dark riding coat hung neatly over broad shoulders, and his polished boots rested beside the fireplace as one of his ranch hands delivered fresh news. The Whitfields aren't struggling anymore. Victor narrowed his eyes. What changed? The cowboy came back. The stranger? With wagons full of supplies. Victor walked slowly toward the frosted window overlooking the neighboring ranch. I was expecting that property to be mine before spring. For months, he had quietly waited. The Whitfields had been running out of food, running out of money, running out of time. Sooner or later, Margaret would have no choice but to sell the ranch for whatever price he offered. Now everything had changed, because of one cowboy. Victor's expression hardened. If kindness won't move them, he opened a polished leather briefcase resting upon his desk. Inside lay folded legal documents. He slowly smiled. There are other ways to take a ranch. As snow continued falling across the valley, a rider left the Kane Ranch carrying sealed county papers beneath his coat. Far below, Daniel worked peacefully beside Margaret, unaware that another battle had already begun. Snow blanketed the Colorado Valley as peacefully as ever. But we all know that trouble rarely announces itself with thunder. Sometimes it arrives folded inside a sheet of paper. The rider from Victor Kane's ranch reached Whitfield Ranch shortly after sunrise. Daniel Brooks was repairing the final section of split-rail fence when hoofbeats echoed across the frozen yard. Margaret stepped onto the porch, wiping flour from her hands. The stranger dismounted without greeting. I've been sent to deliver these. He handed Margaret a sealed packet before climbing back into the saddle and riding away without another word. The smile faded from her face as she broke the wax seal. Her hands began to tremble. Daniel walked toward her. What is it? She slowly looked up. Victor Kane says part of this ranch belongs to him. Silence settled across the yard. Ezra Whitfield carefully adjusted his spectacles before reading the papers himself. They're claiming the eastern pasture, the creek, and nearly half our grazing land. Lucy's face turned pale. But that's where our cattle stay. Daniel remained calm. There has to be some mistake. Before anyone could answer, another rider appeared. Sheriff Owen Briggs. The gray-mustached lawman removed his hat as he approached the porch. I heard Victor filed his claim at the county office yesterday. Margaret handed him the documents. Sheriff Briggs read every page carefully. His expression grew thoughtful. "These papers look official." Daniel folded his arms. "Do you believe them?" The sheriff sighed. "I believe they deserve to be investigated." Victor Kane had attached what appeared to be copies of old property surveys, suggesting the original Whitfield boundary had been recorded incorrectly decades earlier. If true, nearly half the ranch could legally become his. Margaret looked across the snow-covered pasture. Everything her late husband had worked to build suddenly seemed uncertain. Daniel quietly rested a reassuring hand upon her shoulder. "We're not giving up." The sheriff nodded. "We'll start with the county records." The following morning, the four of them traveled into Silver Creek. Snow covered the rooftops, while townspeople hurried along wooden sidewalks bundled against the bitter wind. Inside the county records office, shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Old survey books, land grants, maps, property deeds. Dust covered nearly everything. The elderly clerk welcomed Sheriff Briggs warmly. "We're looking for the original Whitfield survey." The clerk frowned. "I already searched yesterday." "And? It's gone." Margaret blinked. "Gone? The file should be right here." He pointed toward an empty space on the shelf. "I've worked here 30 years. It never disappeared before." Daniel exchanged a quiet glance with the sheriff. Neither needed to say what both were thinking. Someone had removed it. Hours passed. Every ledger was examined. Every drawer searched. Nothing. Victor's survey remained. The Whitfield survey had vanished. As evening approached, disappointment settled heavily over the group. Back at the ranch, silence filled the cabin. Lucy sat beside the fire holding one of Ezra's old family photographs. Daniel quietly sharpened an axe near the hearth. Margaret stared through the frosted window toward the snow-covered pasture. Finally, Ezra spoke. "I remember something." Everyone looked toward him. "My son, Thomas." His weathered face brightened slightly. "He never trusted paper alone." Margaret leaned closer. "What do you mean?" "When he bought this ranch, he told me." Ezra paused, searching his memory. "He buried a survey marker himself." Sheriff Briggs frowned. "A survey marker?" Ezra nodded slowly. "There was an old county stone. The original one. He said if anyone ever questioned the boundary." Ezra smiled faintly. "The land itself would answer." Daniel set the axe aside. "Where?" Ezra closed his eyes. For several long moments, no one spoke. Then he pointed toward the window. The eastern pasture, near the giant cottonwood, the one beside the creek. Margaret's eyes widened. The old tree. "We've walked past it hundreds of times." The next morning arrived cold and bright. Fresh snow sparkled beneath the rising sun, as Daniel, Sheriff Briggs, Margaret, Ezra, and Lucy made their way toward the enormous cottonwood tree, standing proudly beside the frozen creek. Its massive trunk had watched over Whitfield Ranch for generations. Daniel drove his shovel into the frozen earth. Again and again. The ground resisted every strike. Sheriff Briggs joined him. Soon both men dug carefully around the ancient roots while Margaret brushed away loose snow. Lucy suddenly pointed. "There!" Something gray emerged beneath the frozen soil. Daniel knelt. His gloved hands carefully cleared away decades of dirt. A weathered stone marker slowly appeared. Deeply carved into its face were barely visible letters. Sheriff Briggs wiped away the remaining mud. Then he smiled. "The county seal." Margaret covered her mouth. Ezra quietly removed his hat. The old marker stood exactly where Thomas Whitfield had said it would. But one question still remained. Would the county records match the stone? The sheriff carefully lifted a rolled oilskin packet hidden beneath the marker. Inside rested a faded survey map, protected from the weather for years. He slowly unfolded it beneath the winter sunlight. His eyes widened as he compared every line. Then Sheriff Owen Briggs looked toward Margaret with quiet certainty. He unfolded the original county survey and quietly said, "This ranch never belonged to Victor Kane." For several long seconds, The only sound across the snowy pasture was the whisper of winter wind through the ancient cottonwood branches. Sheriff Owen Briggs carefully held the original survey in both hands. No one spoke. No one needed to. The faded ink, the county seal, and the signatures left no room for doubt. Whitfield Ranch had always belonged to the Whitfield family. Victor Kane's claim had never been legitimate. Margaret's shoulders trembled as years of worry seemed to melt away all at once. She looked toward the snow-covered fields her husband had loved so deeply, and tears quietly rolled down her cheeks. Daniel Brooks gently rested a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We're going home. Let's share." The following morning, the courthouse in Silver Creek filled long before sunrise. Ranchers removed their hats as Sheriff Briggs entered carrying the original survey wrapped carefully inside the weathered oilskin packet. Victor Kane stood confidently beside his attorney, dressed in his elegant black riding coat. He offered Margaret a cold smile, as though victory had already been decided. Judge Abigail Harper adjusted her spectacles as Sheriff Briggs approached the bench. "What have you found, Sheriff?" "The truth." He carefully unfolded the original survey before the courtroom. Every eye followed the yellowed paper. The judge compared it with Victor Kane's recently filed documents. Her expression slowly hardened. She looked toward Victor. "Where did your survey originate?" Victor hesitated. "It was copied from older records." Sheriff Briggs quietly stepped forward. The original county file disappeared only days before Mr. Kane filed his claim. The courtroom fell silent. The elderly county clerk slowly rose from his chair. "I searched every shelf myself." Judge Harper turned another page. Then another. Finally, she placed both surveys side by side. "The boundary lines don't match." She looked directly at Victor. "The original survey clearly establishes the Whitfield property exactly where the stone marker was found." Victor's confident expression disappeared. The judge's voice remained calm but firm. "This court rejects your claim in its entirety." She struck the gavel. "Whitfield Ranch remains the lawful property of Margaret Whitfield." A wave of relief swept through the courtroom. Several ranchers quietly applauded. Lucy threw her arms around Margaret. Ezra lowered his head, with grateful tears shining beneath his silver eyebrows. Daniel simply smiled. Justice had spoken. News spread quickly across the valley. Within 2 days, neighbors began arriving at Whitfield Ranch before sunrise. One family repaired broken sections of fencing. Another delivered hay. Several ranch hands rebuilt the aging livestock shelter. Blacksmiths repaired worn hinges and wagon wheels without asking for payment. Even families who had little to spare brought blankets, canned vegetables, seed grain, and fresh bread. Kindness had become contagious. Daniel worked beside everyone else from dawn until dusk. He repaired corrals, straightened barn walls, reinforced the roof before the deepest winter snows arrived. He never acted like the ranch belonged to him. He simply worked as though protecting someone else's home mattered just as much as protecting his own. One evening, as the final fence rail was fastened into place, Ezra quietly joined Margaret beside the porch. The old man watched Daniel teaching Lucy how to safely brush one of the horses. "He reminds me of Thomas." Margaret smiled softly. "So do I." Several days later, the ranch gathered inside the warm cabin after another light snowfall. The long wooden table was fuller than it had been in years. Fresh bread, roasted vegetables, steaming coffee, warm beef stew. Lucy looked around the room with a smile that hadn't left her face for days. Margaret stood slowly. "Daniel." He looked up. She folded her hands together before speaking. "When you first arrived here, you asked only for one meal." Daniel nodded. "You gave me far more than supper." She smiled through grateful tears. "You gave this ranch hope again." The room became wonderfully quiet. Margaret took a deep breath. "If you're willing." "We'd like you to stay." Lucy nearly bounced from her chair. "Please stay." Ezra nodded. This ranch could use another good cowboy. Daniel looked from one face to another. For years, the trail had been his only home. Now, Someone was offering him a place to belong. He removed his black felt hat. "I'd be honored." Lucy's joyful laughter filled the cabin. Sock. Later that evening, snow drifted gently beyond the frosted windows. The lanterns cast warm golden light across the room. Margaret carried one final bowl of stew to Daniel. He accepted it carefully. For a long moment, he simply looked at it. Then he smiled. Margaret laughed softly. "Something funny?" Daniel shook his head. "The last time I held one of your bowls, I had nothing. And now?" He looked around the cabin. Ezra resting peacefully beside the fire. Lucy smiling as she fed tiny scraps of bread to the ranch dog. The warm glow of family replacing the loneliness of endless trails. Daniel quietly answered, "Some debts aren't paid with money." Margaret smiled. "I suppose they're paid another way. They're paid by remembering." Together they shared supper while winter settled peacefully over Whitfield Ranch. Outside, snow covered the fences, barns, and quiet pastures. Inside, laughter returned to a home that had nearly lost hope. One simple bowl of stew had changed 2 lives forever. And sometimes, in the American frontier, the smallest act of kindness became the greatest legacy a person could leave. Thank you for riding with us through another journey across the Old West. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes kindness always finds its way home. We'll see you in the next frontier story.